here we go then. Top bearing. On this particular bike, if you move the handlebars, you get movement here. That is flicking across like that. The reason is because the bearing that's in there is US, and it allows a bit of movement. It's dangerous because this is the top yoke. If this comes apart at high speed, you're kissing your butt goodbye. So how do we replace it? I'll show you. Right, so this cap has to be prised off nice and gently. It comes off with it easy anyway. Prise that off. Then this bolt here needs to be undone. These bolts here have to be undone in order to remove the two handlebar parts, and obviously once you release that, the yoke is free from the frame, so don't completely undo that yet. Take the handlebars off, and then you'll see that there's a nut at the top that holds the fork tubes to the yoke. So when you've got all these bolts out, just simply remove these last bolts and then carefully lay the handlebars on the side, making sure that you don't scratch the fairings. Good idea to put something on the fairing. Then you get this bit here, look, you pop this off, and underneath there's a nut. That nut retains the fork tube. Same both sides. So you remove that nut. This is now loose. Remove that nut completely. The tubes will then slide out. You can then undo that completely, and then the whole yoke will come off. Then you can remove the ignition switch, and then the yoke is completely free from the bike, which allows you then to gain access to this bearing, because we are going to replace this bearing. This bearing is scrap, so we're going to replace that bearing with a brand new one. Job done. The yoke is just separate. Now completely undo that to remove the yoke from the frame, and then we'll invert it, undo the ignition switch, and then the yoke itself can come right off without any more grief. Place this spanner there on top of the yoke, 14mm socket, undo and remove that bolt, or that nut should I say. It's not a bolt, it's a nut. Do that both sides, and then you can feed the tubes through. On the other side. Remove it completely. I said completely. Of course that takes 3 times longer than anything else to do, because it's an absolute arse. It's a good idea to weight the back of the bike so that comes up, so that then the tubes can be gently removed and you haven't got the weight of the suspension up against the yoke. Now gently remove these tubes. Because once these tubes come out, the front suspension's not... I'll just remove that. Invert, and you should then be able to remove these 2 bolts, which will allow the ignition switch to be taken off. To remove the central bolt, place it in the vise and just use the grip of the vise to push it out. Once removed, examine the condition of the thread very carefully. Examine the condition of the thread in the head very carefully, and in fact screw the two together to feel that it goes in there properly, because if that's loose in any way, then that can be an issue. See, look at that movement there, look. That is just as important as the bearing, because if that's knackered, even a brand new bearing, it will still move. Now, remove the circlip gently. Then heat it up, and then put it in the vise, press the bearing out. Install in the vise, put a socket in the back, wind the vise up until the bearing's right out as far as the vise. Then you can remove the yoke from the vise, but it's still hot, and tap the bearing right out. Brand new bearing. I've already installed the bolt. Now that I've checked it, brand new bearing in the freezer. Don't tell the wife. With that still hot, get the bearing from the freezer and then just once it's fully in, replace the circlip. Make sure it goes right into the groove. That's it. That retains the bearing. Then that is ready to fit back on the bike. Make sure before you screw it in, use some permanent locking thread lock. Put that on there so that once it's in position, it cannot come undone, because if it comes undone, you're doomed. And then you get the thread lock and you give it a nice soaking in thread lock, because you don't ever want that to come out. Next, once it's fitted, torque the bolt up. I don't know what the torque setting is. I'll check in the manual and then I'll put it on the screen. Torque it up and then refit the central popper. The thing is, it takes 24 hours for the thread lock to go off. So unless you really go, don't use the bike for at least 24 hours. Now you've got to feed the fork tubes back through here, making sure that the cables and all that are in the right position. Let's do them both up. Put the little caps back on. And then gently, carefully refit the handlebars, making sure that all the cables are not trapped and they're in the right place, etc. Then do them up. And there you go, job done. All nice and put back together, solid as a rock. Perfect. It's quite a common job apparently on these 1100s. I've never come across it before on any of the other bikes I've ever owned, but I did on this one. So that's another job done, and yeah, hope that helped you. Take care everybody.